thinking about violence, and what I am partly interested in this kind of paper, which is a broad sweep about how we're using certain concepts and how we are investing certain concepts with a normative character, that we want to think about violence often, of course, because we want to live in a society that is free of violence, that has less violence, or that is characterized by what we call a condition of peace. So violence as a phenomenon, I would say, is one of those things when you are thinking about it as a scholar, you are immediately immersing yourself in a terrain, in a field that is highly overdetermined by a certain normative character, right? And what I'm partly trying to do is to disentangle my approach from from starting with the point one, that violence is bad. So I'm taking my cue from the idea that what happens if violence is something that is part of our modernity, right? And to that extent, I would say that we have to really think more carefully about the autobiography of the modern state and the way it tells its story about itself in relation to the question of violence. And it tells that story through the progression from the state of nature, and we all know social contract theory, from the state of nature through to political society, where law becomes the embodiment of a kind of peace that is governed by what Kant would call the highest form of reason, right? So there's a teleology at work here. We move from chaos to peace through law. Now, I think that that is a story we have to question in a way, right? Because it's a story that reinscribes a whole set of problematic politics, problematic histories, and so on, and obscures the history of the state itself, particularly in colonial and post-colonial societies. So first, the idea that the move towards rules is somehow a process that gets rid of violence is something we have to think about carefully. And this is the point about, of course, the idea then of the distinction between a justified violence, a good violence, and a bad violence, which is partly also why I like the project that Ivor is invested in, which is to think about what is happening. Because I think that where we are within the kind of normative frameworks we work within, we often have a tendency to, of course, characterize in our scholarly work, in our policy thinking, what is going on by what is not happening, so that it does not conform to a certain image of what the ideal would be, what a good community, for example, would be, when in fact sometimes what is being brought into existence are forms of sociality, forms of community, forms of being together that are founded on principles that we might not necessarily like, that we are troubled by. But in some ways, if we are going to think kind of have a policy-oriented approach, which is thinking about solutions, and we're going to have to think about what the problem is more carefully before we rush to solutions.